So I am, unlike probably most of the people here, I don't actually identify as a developer. I'm a UX designer, UX researcher, and product manager. But I do work with a number of engineers and data scientists. And so I want to talk about today is how our teams have worked together in order to make sure that we're designing for trust in the product and everything that they spend a lot of time, all of the time and effort they put into designing machine learning algorithms, making sure that it's actually working for the user, that it's understandable. And just because I find that sometimes different terms are used differently among different organizations, just for a quick overview of what I mean when I say certain words, I know that the term data science is thrown around a lot. I know that it can mean for some people anything from doing business analytics and to other people doing more advanced machine learning work. So when I say data science and when I say working with our data science team, working with the data scientists in our organization, the team that I worked with are largely focused on machine learning, that second type of data science. And then when I say artificial intelligence and machine learning, specifically I'm talking about it in the context of it being applied within a product. So I'll talk about a couple of the different features that a company I worked for had in our product. And most often than not, the way that we applied that machine learning was we offered predictive analytics capabilities. So we were able to, based on information we learned from historical data, predict a future outcome for some of our clients, and then display that recommendation to our clients in our product. So when I say those terms, that's sort of what I'm referring to. And I always like to start off with a brief agenda of everything that I'm going to cover. So I'll first start off by talking about how I became interested in this topic of designing for machine learning products in the first place, and why I think it really matters to think about designing for trust in the context of not just advancing everything on machine learning on the technology front, but also on the design front as well. I'll then talk about 3 lessons that I learned in my experience when designing for machine learning products. And I'll talk about also how each of these lessons draw from a different discipline within the field of user experience. And then finally, I'll cover a case study where I outline and show you an example of something that we designed and then redesigned using some of those lessons learned that I will talk about soon. So first of all, why did I start thinking about this in the first place? It all started a couple of years ago. So right now I'm an independent consultant, but previously I was working at a startup. And the startup that I worked for, a key part of how we are applying artificial intelligence to some of our data products was what got us our initial rounds of funding. And it made sense in the context, right? Because everywhere around us, you could see how artificial intelligence, and people were talking about how it might disrupt a lot of different industries. And every day when I was talking to some of our clients and I was talking to other designers, I got a lot of people asking me certain questions like, are the algorithms here to take my job? And at first I laughed, but then I started to think more critically about why they were asking that. And I try to guess, what kinds of jobs are probably not as at risk for being replaced by robots. And I started to think, well, surely it must be a profession that is a little bit more, requires a lot of schooling, requires a lot of calculation and the kind of analysis that today we imagine only humans can do. Surely someone like a doctor will be safe from the sort of incoming robots. And I found out that actually I was a little wrong in terms of my hypothesis for which industries might be more likely or less likely to be replaced or augmented by artificial intelligence. There was a piece that was pretty well written that came out in the New Yorker a few years ago. And it talked about how certain parts of even, say, a physician's workflow are actually quite easily replaced or augmented by artificial intelligence. And so a key part of some fields of medicine is looking at different x-rays and trying to determine through those images what kind of disease a patient might have. And so they did a study where they, put a bunch of images in front of a bunch of board-certified physicians, and they tried to see how accurate these physicians would be able to diagnose the patient. And then they also fed these same images to an algorithm and tried to see how accurate the algorithm would be. And it turns out the algorithm outperformed the physicians by a slight margin. But what this article also highlighted was that in the patient experience, for a patient to trust a diagnosis, it's not just knowing that something is more accurate, it's also about the relationship you develop with your caregiver or your physician. So a patient, when they're diagnosed with a disease, will want to have a conversation with their doctor. They'll want to better understand, how did I get this disease? Is it genetic, or is it something caused by my environment? A doctor would be able to ask them questions to understand, has something recently happened in your life that caused a lot of stress? Is there anything changing in your life that you may not have mentioned since the last time you visited? And it's that relationship and that conversation that really helps build trust between a patient and a doctor, and it makes a patient more likely to trust that doctor's advice if they say, okay, well, now that we've diagnosed you with this, you should then do this. And I think that it's also, related very much to the fact that you could be the best physician in the world. You can be very accurate in the way that you predict what kind of disease someone might have. But if you have a poor bedside manner, you're definitely much more likely to get sued. So I started thinking about this. Okay, this is sort of this interesting relationship between humans and artificial intelligence in the field of medicine. What other industries could this question apply to? And naturally, working at an enterprise software company, I started to think about our product and the relationship that our clients had with our product. So the company I previously worked for offered a software product that was for primarily legal and policy professionals. And a key part of our offering was being able to predict how likely a piece of legislation was to pass and become a law. And we were able to do this at the state and at the federal level. And so very early on, before we became, more of a real company, people were pretty skeptical of our product because even though it was pretty accurate, we were a newer company, this wasn't really a field that was very heavy on data analysis as a part of the job. It was built on a lot of relationships. And that's a key part of how people who were hired into this job did their work, and it was also how they, when they were moving from one job to another, a key part of what they offered was bringing their network with them. And I then was able to find out that there was actually a venture capitalist who had invested in a couple of similar enterprise software companies, similar in the sense that they were both B2B and had a similar business model where their customers were paying a monthly or yearly subscription. And they started talking about how a lot of other enterprise software companies were building predictive analytics into their offerings. So probably the most well-known example would be Salesforce launching an initiative where they would integrate AI capabilities into their product. And the key question they were asking was, not only will your users trust your analysis, but would they be willing to pay for it? And as an investor, that makes sense for that being the way that they would measure that success. But beyond sort of a couple of these industries that could be disrupted, I also started to think about the impact that a lot of machine learning algorithms will have on our society and the responsibility of my field as designers to sort of be a part of that. What role does design play as artificial intelligence touches a couple of these different industries? And I think beyond just thinking about the potential computing impact of artificial intelligence developing, I started also naturally to think about the social impact or the emotional impact it might have on a relationship between humans and the way that they interact with computers. And I found that there were actually a couple of organizations that were not only thinking about the way that AI could advance computationally, but also the way that it could help build or augment social and emotional intelligence for certain communities. So this is a quote from a woman who founded a company that is trying to use artificial intelligence research to help children with autism better be able to express their emotions because it's something that might be kind of difficult for them. And I think this other quote from a professor at Stanford University really highlights the need for the importance of AI to consider a lot of the different factors that they may not be implicitly including in their algorithm, but might be unintentionally being portrayed. So I think one of the best examples of this comes from the field of criminal justice. There was an expose or investigative journalism piece that came out a couple years ago in ProPublica, and it looked at this piece of software that is being used in a couple of cities and states across the United States. And these algorithms were trying to predict the likelihood that someone would be rearrested for a crime after they were let out of jail. And they included a couple of different factors in this algorithm, but one thing they didn't explicitly include was race. And what that meant was that it would be implicitly included. So someone who is more likely to be subject to human bias, because the algorithm was based on historical data, it said that people who were more likely to be black or brown would be more likely to be rearrested because the people who would be arresting them had this historical pattern of being more likely to rearrest them. And that actually meant that they got harsher sentences because there was this thing that was predicting that they would be more likely to commit another crime or be rearrested. And so I think as we think about examples like that, especially being technologists and leaders in our field, we should really try to think about what is sort of not only the impact of the problem you're trying to solve today, but how does that fit into the whole system overall? So now that I've given you a brief primer on sort of what interested me in thinking about this field in the first place, I'll just quickly go over some lessons that I learned. So the first lesson that I learned when I was beginning to design for a lot of these predictive analytics features was that less is definitely more. And in many cases, it is probably in your best interest to think very critically about the information you want to include, and also more importantly, the information you want to exclude. So as I was starting to work on a couple of areas within our product, I was working a lot more day-to-day with our data science team. And as I was working with them, I started to think about how the way that we were thinking about problem solving were different in some ways, and what might impact that. And what I realized kind of quickly is that my colleagues, many of whom had PhDs in computer science and economics, they had gone through a lot more school than I had because they had done a PhD program. And a huge part of doing an academic research-focused program is being able to show your work. So they were very concerned, oh, if we say that we predict this, we should also include a couple disclaimers about why we're predicting this and all of this data to back up all these different factors leading up to this conclusion. They were very focused on that because I think if you think back to your own experience in school, right? I know that when I was in math class in middle school, I would just try to finish the problem set as quickly as possible. And then my teacher would always say that's not good enough, you have to show your work. And I think that for a lot of my colleagues, that message, you have to show your work, was really ingrained in them for a lot longer because they had been in an academic setting for much longer. And so as we were paper prototyping a couple of different solutions to this problem, I noticed that a lot of them were really adamant that we give a lot of detail to our users. But when we actually tested this, we found that it was often very confusing to have too much information. So the first thing we learned was that as we were iterating the designs over time, it was sometimes better to exclude certain pieces of information and then having it be available for the people who did seek it out. The next lesson that we learned was that it was really important to ask the right questions. And whereas the first lesson draws from the field of data visualization, this principle draws from the field of user research. So as we started to do some user research on some of the designs that we had, it was very easy for me to fall back on a couple of user research methods that were part of my sort of toolkit as a designer for designing other features and other products within our portfolio. But I learned very quickly that designing for machine learning features was kind of a unique animal. And if I asked a certain question in a certain way, it often led to a lot of confusion. So some examples were, if we wanted to figure out if something made sense to someone, it wasn't good to ask, does this make sense? And the reason for that is oftentimes your users, they stare at you across the table when you're conducting user research. And they're not, stupid. They know that it's probably you who spent the last, 3 or 4 months of your career working on this feature. And most humans like to make other people happy. And so if you say, like, does this make sense, even if they don't quite understand it, they might say, yeah, of course. And also most people don't want to look stupid. So even if it doesn't make sense, they might just say that because they're too embarrassed to ask. Another question that we tried to ask in some of our user research early on was we would ask them, what would you do here, or what would you call this? Because we were having a hard time thinking about how we wanted to name and brand certain capabilities within our product. But we learned that it was very overwhelming for a lot of our users to hear this question. I mean, their job wasn't to name products or name features. And so it kind of made them a little flustered, and it set a weird tone for the rest of the interview. And instead, we started thinking about first writing down the questions that we wanted answers to, and then staring at them and then editing them so that we could ask the same question or get the same answer, but with a different question. And so one thing that worked out really well for us was we knew from earlier design research that a huge part of our users' jobs, or something that was very true for most of them, was that there was a good amount of turnover in the industry. It was very typical for someone in their profession to be changing companies fairly often. And so what that also meant is that if they were an organization, it was very likely that they would have colleagues that would turn over pretty quickly. And so we framed a lot of our questions in a more situational context. So we would say, imagine you had a colleague who just joined your team, and they're not familiar with the tools that you use. How would you explain this product or this feature to them? And that was a question that really resonated with them because it was a situation that they could identify with because it happened to them quite often. And it was also understandable. And it actually answered some of the questions we wanted to get at, right? Because if they were going to explain to us how they would explain this product to their colleague, we would obviously get a couple keywords that would point us in the right direction of what to name something. And we would be able to understand from the way they explained it if our feature made sense to them. And then probably the most important thing here is that we really tried to learn and listen from the questions that they asked us. And for any of you who do user interviews often, or for those of you who are looking to do more of them soon, one really great tip I have for you is to say at the start of your interview to your users, you're probably going to ask me questions, and I might respond with a question. And I promise I'm not doing it to be annoying. I'm not trying to frustrate you. It will feel frustrating. And the reason I'm going to respond with a question when you ask me a question is because I really want to know why you're asking that question. And I promise at the end of the interview, I will answer all of your questions. So anytime a user would ask me a question in an interview, I would sometimes respond, oh, like, why do you ask that? And it probably did get a little annoying after the third or fourth time that they did that, and I responded with a question. But saying that really upfront helps remind them that this might happen, and it also makes sure that you're getting the insights you need for why people are asking certain questions in the process. And in our case, when users would ask us certain questions, and we heard some of the same questions over and over again, that really made sure that as we were going through our design process, it was very centered on that question that users were asking us. And the third lesson that we learned was that writing well mattered a lot. And I don't know about you, but as a designer, a key part of my job is asking people questions and synthesizing what I learned from them and putting that together into something that I design and put back out into the world. And I've always thought to myself that if I weren't a designer, I would want to be a journalist because it would be very similar. Just instead of designing something, I would write an article. And so when I had an opportunity to do some writing work in the context of design, I was really excited because it was a chance to sort of tap into that part of something that I was really passionate about. But what I learned pretty quickly was that it was probably not helpful that I was really into writing because my nature when I was trying to write something was I would either go for a tone that replicated some of my favorite publications to read, which was in the context of a software product, a little too wordy, a little off brand, or I would write in a tone that was maybe too fun and too quirky for the particular brand that I was writing for at the time. And so what I learned pretty quickly was that it helped to have a little bit of structure and process around the way that I was writing for our product. So I would start out by first just jotting down who my audience was and what their purpose was as they were coming into this part of our product. I would then try to write the way that I thought would make sense for the product, just what came naturally to me at first, but then I would audit what I wrote afterward for just like a check in tone and if it matched the brand voice. And then most importantly, I try to go back and make sure that everything I've written, if it could be said in fewer words, then I would try to say it in fewer words. So if you're looking for resources on doing a little bit more writing and just getting more exposed to the field of content strategy, which is where this lesson draws from, certain resources I would recommend are plainlanguage.gov, which focuses on making sure that your language in your product is readable for audience members who may be reading at a different grade or age level. And then also a book called Letting Go of the Words. Okay, so now that I've talked about 3 lessons that I learned when I was doing some of this design work, I want to just quickly show you one of the features that we worked on our team and how we were able to apply some of these lessons learned. So our design process at the software company was probably similar to the way that you see most human-centered design integrated into a software development process, which is we first focus a lot of time on just defining the problem. What was the problem that we were trying to solve with this design? In the example I'm going to show you next, the problem was a lot of our users had trouble figuring out how they wanted to allocate their resources when they were thinking about the way that they would strategize around which bills were getting passed in certain legislatures. And so this particular feature helped show them how likely a piece of legislation was to pass in any given legislature so that they could focus their time and energy on the ones where something was actually going to move forward. The next phase would be to get our team together, come up with a couple of ideas to address the problem, and prototype a couple of solutions. Then we would test these prototypes out with users. We would test it with not only our current customers, but also prospective customers, so people who fit the profile of our user, but maybe weren't using our product day-to-day already. And then from there, iterate on the design, and then developed the actual product. So a good amount of this work happened before anything was ever written or built actually in production. So this is an example of the predictive analytics feature that I talked about earlier. So you can see here there is a score for how likely something is to get to the floor, and then another score for how likely once it gets to the floor it is to pass. And in the legislative process in many states within the US, what the first score focuses on is how likely something is to even get out of committee. And then the second floor focuses on the people who are voting on this, how likely are they to vote yes or no. One thing that people had a lot of trouble with this particular design, which was not designed by a designer, it was designed by like some very early engineers and data scientists at the company, was that this distribution score chart, so this area graph that you see here, that was something that an early data scientist insisted on because they wanted to convey, hey, like a 95% in one state means mean something different from a 95% in another state, because some states might just have more bills that are likely to get to the floor. A lot of our users thought this was a graph of how the score changed over time. I mean, that makes sense. It looks like a chart that shows how something changes over time. And so they had a lot of trouble reading this graph and understanding it, or worse, they were reading it and interpreting it differently. And another thing that people were pretty confused about was when they were buying the software, when they were on the phone with a sales rep and someone was explaining it to them, it made a lot of sense. But once they had to use it day to day themselves, they were completely lost. And so also around this time, our company started to change our strategy for how we were pricing our product. So early on in the company life cycle, we were charging a different price for our software with this analytics and our software without the analytics. But we realized pretty quickly that that wasn't the key value add difference in our customers. Where they found the difference in value was if they had one person using the software product or they had a team of people using the product. And so we were starting to change our pricing strategy so that people would pay more if they had more people on the team using the product, but everyone would have access to the analytics. So you can imagine that's pretty significant for a pretty small company that was just getting started, because then all of a sudden people who had chosen to buy a version of the product without the analytics suddenly had it, which meant they were even less likely to know how to use it. But the most important thing we learned in our user research as we were testing different designs with our customers was that people kept asking us why the score was a certain way. Almost every single user interview, at some point, a user would ask us, well, why is it this score? How did it get to this? And that to us meant that was the key to redesigning it, because that was the only piece of information they really wanted when they were looking at this. It wasn't enough to just know the number. They had to figure out why it was this particular number. And they also kind of wanted some guidance on what they should do with that information. So this is the version of this page and this is what it looked like after we redesigned it the first time. And I actually think that I'm pretty close to a couple of my former coworkers, so I think they're actually redesigning and tweaking it a little bit even further. So what you can see here is that the numbers disappeared completely. What we realized was the reason why this made sense to users when someone was on the phone explaining it to them was they kept asking the question, well, what does this mean? Like, compared to other bills in the state legislature, does this mean it's more likely to pass or less likely to pass? And that was the only thing they really wanted to know. So we just got rid of the numbers, or we hid them, actually, and we just summarized what that graph was trying to tell them with copy. And the explanations under that, so you can see the little green and red arrows, one of the key issues with the early version of the design was that the specific reasons, oftentimes they would be not ordered in a way that reflected how much weight each reason was in the algorithm itself. So you could have something that had a very high score, but it would have, like 1 or 2 green arrows and 3 or 4 red arrows. So for a lot of users, they were pretty confused. They're like, well, there's more reasons why this wouldn't pass, but the score is still pretty high. Like, why is that? And so what we did was we redid some of the copy within those explanations so that it better reflected what it made sure that different parts of the design weren't visually conflicting with each other. And then in the copy, we try to make sure the tone was a bit more conversational. So it sounded more like someone reading you what this said instead of like a graph where you had to like read it and try to interpret it all yourself. And I hinted at this a little bit earlier, but at the time, a good amount of our revenue was tied to these predictive analytics. So it did mean that for some of our senior leadership, it was quite risky to try to change everything and change the design completely. So one tactic that I used to try to make this case to our leadership that this was worth investing in and redesigning was I did a quick search in our internal drive for a couple of different documents that people on the team had put together for explaining how this feature worked. And I found over 140 documents that employees had created to explain this feature to other employees. And then I sort of put this all together and told our leadership, if we ourselves within the company who work here day in and day out, and this is what we do 9 to 5, if we can't even understand this feature, how can we expect our users to? And that was one of the reasons that sort of helped sway them to put in the resources to redesign this, even though redesigning it was pretty risky given how much revenue was attributed to it. After testing a couple different versions of this design through that earlier design process I showcased, we were able to see that many of the users that we tested with were able to concisely and accurately articulate how they would explain this feature to a coworker, which was sort of the metric of success we are using in our research. And that made us a little more confident that we could then develop this and ship this redesign without completely alienating our existing user base. So just to quickly recap what we covered, in our case, sometimes it helped to just hide some of those numbers, hide some of that work. In testing some of these prototypes, we learned that it was really important to ask the question in the right way. And more importantly, it was important to listen to the questions that users were asking us. And when we were actually working with the content through all the details of the product, we learned that writing well really mattered. So I think I came away from this experience learning that even though I can't really say if an algorithm will take someone's job or not, I can say that as a designer working in this field, working in technology, we have to consistently adapt our skill sets. And in working with my colleagues, the different engineers on this team and the different data scientists on the team, they really helped develop a better understanding of how user research would inform their work and how getting feedback would help them prioritize whether or not it made sense to spend more effort on making something right versus making sure that it was, if something was pretty accurate, that it was conveyed the right way. What we also learned was that oftentimes for whether you're thinking about this in the case of medicine, you're thinking about this in the case of our industry, for a lot of users, why something happens matters a little bit more than what something is or how accurate something is. It might not make sense to some of us, but many humans may prefer something that is maybe a little less accurate if they have a chance to interact with it and ask a couple questions than something that is more accurate, but you don't really know how it works. Yeah, thank you so much. I do think we have a bit of time for questions if people have any questions. If you don't feel comfortable asking your questions here, you can find me after, or you can tweet at me, and I will get back to you. Thank you. I also can't see that well, but yeah. Does anyone have any questions?